Welcome, everyone, to a very special series of the GCNC Worldview podcast. I'm your host today, Jill Reddish. I'm the co-founder of the Global Cannabis Network Collective. And today we're diving in to a special series focused on leadership. We're kind of calling it the People Power series. We're talking to movers and shakers in the cannabis industry to focus on management strategy and asking questions about how is it that people power is making the difference between success and obsolescence for teams all over the globe? And we're bringing in leaders from around cannabis to ask them what they're seeing, how they're seeing people be successful, and diving into those success stories. And I'm very pleased to be joined by a special co-host for this series, Stephanie Powell, the CEO and founder of Emerald Lane Recruiting. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi, Jill. I'm really excited and honored to be a part of this series and to work alongside the GCNC and sit with so many amazing humans. So thanks so much. And I look forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Stephanie, you with Emerald Lane have been a GCNC member for a few years now. So we're all really excited to kick off this deeper collaboration because, as we all know, it's the people who power the cannabis. And so let's go ahead and dive on in with our first guest today. I'm very excited to welcome and introduce Mitchell Osak, the CEO of Quanta Consulting. Welcome, Mitchell.
Welcome. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for including me.
Yeah, we're excited to dive on in and learn about your career. I know you're someone who, like many folks, has transitioned from kind of big mainstream brands and gone into cannabis and has really made a career out of consulting and focusing on strategy, business development, all of those exciting things with a global view. So, would Mitchell, would you kind of go ahead and let us hear about your kind of background? How did you get to now?
I have an MBA. Thank you, Jill. I have an MBA from the University of Toronto. Was in a variety of industries, including 4 years of brand management at Procter and Gamble on some large brands like Tide and Cascade. And then I bought and sold a company. Wasn't sure what I was going to do. And in 2000, I started up my own strategy consulting shop. Which ended up merging into a large accounting advisory firm called Grant Thornton around 2016. And it was in 2016 that I discovered the emerging legal adult use cannabis industry in Canada. I saw an opportunity to jump into that. I was born and bred in suburban Toronto, so I understood the cannabis community and I knew how big the market was. And I recognized a global opportunity to see an industry germinating, going from the shadows into the legal world. And I jumped at a chance to getting into it. 220 cannabis clients later, here I am talking to you folks.
Amazing. Welcome. So we've got a few fun questions to ask you to guide the conversation. And for that, I'm going to kick it over to Stephanie to really dive into the juicy stuff.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jill and Mitchell. That was a great intro. You and I have had some amazingly prolonged hangouts in the last couple months of getting to tell each other our stories. And I so appreciate what you've been through and the lessons you had. And when we were putting together the list of what leaders we wanted to have on this podcast and the stories, I immediately, you came to mind. One, because you were just such a first mover in the Canadian space. I thought I was there in early days in 2018, 2019 as a fellow Torontonian and Canadian, but you were really there in those really early days and working with those first, 20 LPs, I think you said, that were coming through the medical program. So I have a lot of respect for not only what you've discovered, for the fact that you've held on and been a part of it, but now also are working across the United States, global markets, and now doing a lot of work within the emerging markets in Africa as well across the cannabis supply chain. So there's just so many insights and so much I want to dive into. We only have 20 minutes today, so I won't take too much time for all of those questions. But no, I really appreciate it. So one of the things about Canada being the first movers is we're the big siblings, right? There was no one who came before us in terms of federal legalization for adult use across a westernized country. And so one of the questions I have is thinking back to those early days, when you started to talk to those first 20 LPs and they're really exploring what a medical program would mean in Canada. what do you recall them coming to you for in terms of just the way they saw that unfolding and how they were really looking at positioning Canada as like a leader in that global space versus actually how it played out?
Well, that's a great question and a big question. So I was approached at the time by a organization that represented the 31 medical license producers at the time, and they would include all the big names that we all would know right now: Aurora, Kronos, and so on and so forth. They were at the time set up to supply medical cannabis to Canadian patients. And at the time, the federal Liberal government under Justin Trudeau had just been elected, and he had made, vague promises at the time that they would be legalizing adult use cannabis. And the organization decided to hire me to do two fundamental streams of work, which were really critical at that time. One of them was what consumer research was available and segmentation research so that these budding, pardon the pun, 31 licensed producers can make sense of what this market could be. Now, again, at the time, that adult use market was all in the illicit shadows, but there was certain usage data and so on, not only within Canada, but also within early US markets like California and Colorado that could inform the Canadian experience. So helping these producers get a sense of who's the consumer, how do they buy, where do they buy, what flower strains. That's what the LPs wanted to know. The second part of the project was we didn't really know where the government was headed as far as regulations, taxes, what private partnership models would be available. Would it be all in the public sector like it is in Quebec versus all private like it is in Alberta? So the question there was, Mitchell, help us undertake some scenario plan. How would our business models be set up under different market structures? And in that case, what would be the economic and financial impact to the industry as well as to our particular companies under those different scenarios? So that was the genesis of the first project. And then they started cascading both broadly to cover other scenarios and more deeply into the supply chain. What did that mean for costs? What does that mean for production? What was the total addressable market going to be? What was the immediate market going to be in the first 6 months?
Mhm. And as that transitioned from that medical side into adult use, right? You're talking about 2016 was when the medical conversation was starting. We had 2018, October was when we legalized for federal adult use. What did you see in that shift of transition? How did either the government or the conversations you were having with management transition through that change?
Well, it was a lot of dealing with uncertainty because these licensed producers were busy raising money, and they were raising money on the basis of a variety of criteria, but one of them was called funded capacity. So the bigger the greenhouse, the more money you would attract on Bay Street. So the individual companies were looking to maximize their own situations and build up enough capacity and expertise to tap this nebulous, newly emerging market. At the same time, the government was trying to figure out, okay, what should the rules and regulations be? What should the tax levels be? Once we set the tax levels, how do we split that between the federal take on that and the provincial take on that? Provincially meaning, what would the provincial wholesalers take of those excise taxes? The difficult part of the entire process was that the government didn't nail down all of their rules until the summer of 2018. And that was happening through the deliberations in our Canadian Senate, which is beyond our House of Commons. So the goalposts were shifting right up until a couple of months of actual legalization. And that created challenges both from the government, doing things like establishing enforcement procedures and policies and so on and so forth, as well as the licensed producers that had to actually figure out what their tax rates were going to be. And consequently, how did they price their products and how do they sell their products? And as you probably know, Stephanie, even after cannabis was legalized in Canada from an adult use perspective, the Ontario government flipped from a liberal government to a conservative government. And from a cannabis perspective, that flipped it from a all public model, which is like our liquor business, the LCBO, to an all private model. So even in Ontario, which was 45% of the total Canadian market, it did a 180-degree turn in the first 1 year of legalization. That created massive challenges, both from a producer perspective, from a consumer confusion perspective, and from a federal government perspective.
Absolutely. And as you were in these roles and supporting the executives and management teams, moving through these transitions, what were you seeing in terms of leadership? Like, how were those leaders so leading their teams or sort of pivoting and trying to get the board of directors on board as there was this massive change, as well we are also navigating a global pandemic in that time, right? What were the sort of traits and characteristics that you saw those leaders be able to guide their teams through that transition?
Yeah, you just talked about a lot of uncertainty for leaders and their teams to be dealing with, and that's one of the key challenges for leadership to address. So I'm so curious to hear about this.
Okay, so I know we have less than 20 minutes now, and you gave me a question that could take 20 hours for me to fulsomely attack, but I will say a couple of things. And my answer is going to be informed by my background, my business background, as well as my educational background. And two areas that I'll bring very quickly are about the appreciation and understanding about behavioral and social psychology, and an understanding of how other industries or other organizations deal with uncertainty. So from an educational background, I did a lot of studying of military history, because fighting wars are high risk with lots of uncertainty. And from a business standpoint, getting people to do things and getting and convincing them requires behavioral and social understanding psychology. So with those two anchors, I will say that a lot of the early cannabis industry in Canada was facing this uncertainty, and the leadership was very typically two kinds of groups of people: Bay Street financiers, because they put in the money, and people who came in from the illicit market into the legal market. The challenges of both of those kinds of leaders is that they all grasp for an anchor to help them understand uncertainty. And in the case of the capital markets folks who came in, they were looking at this very much from a CPG kind of philosophy, because they said, look, we want to build brands, cannabis are brands, so we have to bring in CPG talent, which is one of the ways that I got in, because I came through Procter & Gamble and some other large brands I worked with. On the illicit side, they were thinking about how they operated in the shadows of the illegal economy. They weren't thinking about, we're moving from, let's say growing 100 plants to growing 1,000 plants in industrial scale agriculture. So both of those groups of people created paradigms and thinking processes to understand this industry, and they managed through those principles. And what they at a certain point didn't connect with is that cannabis is cannabis. Cannabis is not CPG, it's not tobacco, it's not alcohol. It has elements of all of those things. But guess what? It also has elements of the fashion industry. It has elements of the tech industry. If you look at extraction services in cannabis, that's very similar to the oil refining industry, believe it or not. It's all about scale and chemistry and so on. So these leaders had a bit of a difficult time transitioning to this, because they were always trying to put a square peg in a round hole. To your point, Stephanie, it took their trials and tribulations when the market didn't take off the way they thought, COVID, and the drying up of capital, to make some of them start to realize, you know what, we have to look at this fundamentally very different. Selling cannabis is not the same as selling Tide. The cultures of the companies are different. You have different access to data. You have different regulations. You have different branding restrictions. It's fundamentally different. So the best leaders that I find in cannabis, both in Canada and the United States, are people who look at this with an open mind, not bringing in any bias or mental constructs, and taking cannabis and the customer for what they are and not what we think they are, because there are brands in cannabis and there are brands in packaged goods, and in most cases there are very different things for a lot of good reasons.
Absolutely. And what you touched on, that's a really North American, a lot of conversations are happening. I met at Benzinga in Chicago, last fall for the first time after running parallel on LinkedIn. So, these are a lot of the conversations we're having in those markets that are really flipping from medical to adult use in a really short period of time, or in Canada in that case. So speaking of that brand development, now we have these Canadian domestic brands and suddenly, and American, domestic brands and companies, they're looking at interstate commerce, but you have Canada now looking at how to broaden revenue streams. And one of those things was to get into this international supply chain and start to do our exporting. So, with Canada being one of the top exporters, but you also see this notion that we're not selling into adult use markets, we're selling into medical markets that are truly medical, that pharmacists, are the ones who are giving it out, are compounding the products, doctors are writing scripts for it. So the brands that are super cool in an adult use rec market are not going to be the same and received in the other end. So as you've worked with some of these groups and the majority of your groups that you're working with to look into global markets, how do you see them transition when they're moving into the medical markets? And what are you hearing from the leaders on the other side of these medical markets when they're connecting or hearing from these leaders coming out of more of the adult use market? Like, how does that sort of translate from what you're hearing?
So sadly, there are still two solitudes in global cannabis. And what do I mean by that? I'll start with the positive side because this is a leadership podcast. The best leaders that I've seen and I've had the honor to work with, who are exporters from Canada, are the people who have an open mind. They don't come in and say, okay, this is what's working in Canada. This is what will work in Germany. They are approaching the German market with a blank sheet of paper, just like they approach the Canadian market. That's number one. Number two is they tend to be much better listeners. So not only you're approaching and you're saying, okay, the German market is going to be different than the Canadian market, but they're actually showing up. The leaders are showing up to different states in Germany, and they're talking to the pharmacists. They're talking to the consumers. They're talking to the telemedicine platforms. They're really, to use a military term, they're leading from the front. And that's gratifying from as a consultant's perspective, because I do a lot of international work, because it's sometimes very hard to transmit back cultural and market differences from the EU, from Israel, from Ukraine, from Australia to somebody sitting in Toronto or Vancouver. It's very different. You have to see it and you have to hear it. And culture really matters when you're exporting. So the best Canadian cannabis leaders are the ones that are doing it the old-fashioned way, listening, doing proper analysis, partnering, and so on and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why they've also been very successful in Canada. They see cannabis for what it is, not what they believe it should be or it is. The other side of that solitude are, let's say, the non-North Americans. The challenges that I'm seeing with them is that they're replicating the same errors that Canadians and Americans made in the early stages of legalization. It's all about high THC. It's all about lowest price. It's not a very disciplined and rigorous view of the market and how do they position themselves in the market to win. And so I don't want to paint them all with a broad brush, but fundamentally, if you look at stock market valuations and you look at the number of companies that are pouring into here, they're replicating the same economic folly that we saw in North America. At the end of the day, they'll work their way through it. The smart ones will learn from us and they'll learn from our American brothers and sisters. But the reality is there's going to be a lot of turmoil on the end user, on the reseller side in a lot of these markets, just because the level of competition, the level of price discounting, and the fact that their companies are still relatively immature from a structure, organizational, and cultural perspective.
Absolutely. All the insight, so many of us joke that we kind of have this crystal ball and no one wants to see it because we've all been through it. And you hear these people on the panels talking about the same thing. And I remember sitting back next to a grower from Canada, very well known at a green tech in Amsterdam, and him just cursing under his breath because he heard the growers saying things. He's like, no, we did learn this in 2017, that this is not the way to do it. And so I think that that's where people like you have an amazing gift where you are able to travel, you're able to go into these emerging markets like Africa that you're doing all this work in. And and we don't have enough time to dive in that today, but I'm excited to have an additional conversation somewhere along the line to learn more about what you're seeing there and the markets that are developing there. But I think there's this notion that like everyone's like, oh, we learned it first. And so people like you can really take those lessons, have seen it, ridden the roller coaster, gone through the washing machine here, and have those personal relationships with the leaders who are on the ground every day, still rooting into these industries and these markets. So all of that insight is super important. And you share so much of that on your LinkedIn. You do a really great job at providing thought leadership in these ways and in addressing some of these challenges in these markets. I know in terms of LinkedIn, you're providing a lot of content. And do you have anything upcoming that we should keep our eyes and ears out for on there that you're excited about, or a recent article that really was one of those like, yeah, I really love this one?
Yeah, I always love to know what topics you think are going to be hot for the next couple months, for the next quarter.
Okay, so again, big question. I'll be pithy when I answer it. So I've started getting a little bit into hemp THC beverages because cannabis companies are jumping into that.
Yeah,
Hemp
we all are. Yeah.
Um, that's another bubble. If we go back to the tulip mania in Holland in the 17th century,
I love a good history reference.
yeah, to European and American railroads and CRM and car, like that's another bubble that's inflating and it's going to pop. I've just written a couple of things on it. I get unbelievable amounts of engagement. Probably 75% appreciate it, 25% hate me because it's like I'm calling their daughter or their cousin ugly. But the reality is I don't know what the last count is, 650 different hemp beverages. If you ever looked at a shelf in a total liquor in the United States, you can't tell the difference between any of them. There will be winners for sure, but there won't be 650 winners. There might be 10, 15 in certain markets because that's the nature of any kind of consumer product. And we talk about what's truly CPG. Hemp THC beverages is CPG and alcohol, and you're not going to have more than 10 brands anywhere because that's how it ends up working out. So that's a bubble that's happening in real time. Some people get it, most people don't, sadly. And that's going to blow up a lot of capital, a lot of careers, and a lot of companies. But it all comes back to human psychology, FOMO, history, even back to the ancient Greeks and Prometheus and all those myths. It's happening right in front of us. So that's a hot topic right now. But I'm just trying to share some of the lessons from history and lessons from cannabis, such that these people maybe they don't go all in on some of their bets, but they hedge, they partner, they reduce the amount of capital and effort, and they dip their toe in and then their leg in before they dive into the lake.
Yeah, there's something to be said for what I'm hearing you say of, like spreading out your risk. I know a lot of operators have gotten into hemp beverages because there is money to be made and there's not a lot of money to be made, a lot of cash to be made in some other sectors. So they're looking at it as, let me get into this, spread my risk a little bit. But to your point, you have to be conscious in that you are actually spreading your risk and not going to lose your shirt in it just to be able to make the quick buck for the next, half a year.
You make an excellent point there. I'm a bit of a nerdy guy, so I look at numbers and data and so on. And what I often tell my cannabis clients, and I have a lot of data to support this, is that in cannabis, you often can make more money by losing less money. And you lose less money by doing less stupid SH, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And jumping into hemp when you really don't have a great product, you don't have a good value proposition or whatever, is doing stupid SH. Not for everybody, but for a lot of them. So like a lot of things, you make money by not losing money. And sadly, it took a number of years of Canadians to experience that, and Americans, but that is an axiom in this industry that I wish more people would pay attention to.
I love that. I love that. So I think a few key takeaways for me as we begin to shift into the end of our conversation here today. I'm hearing the importance of listening, and of course, with you being a data person, that includes listening to the numbers just as much as it includes listening to boots on the ground and to your team members who are subject matter experts, and not being afraid to look at what's happened in history and understand that things are going to repeat themselves, but not be afraid to do some things differently. So I think those will be some of my key takeaways from this conversation. So Stephanie, what final questions do we have for Mitchell?
Yeah, Mitchell, I love that last bit of information that you left, lessons from the Canadian market and what we've seen. I joke about the billion years and we should, I know there's some books coming out, so I'm excited for those lessons to come out and the stories, but all this has been super helpful. And again, you provide so much wisdom in a lot of the writing. Where's the best places for people to find you and follow along and like learn some of these lessons themselves?
So thank you. So I have I post about 3 times a week on LinkedIn. It's all free. And I often comment on other thought leaders as well, but you can connect with me there. I've got almost 20,000 connections. So chances are most of the people listening here will be connected with me. And, the LinkedIn algorithm gets a little screwy. And, I often get messages from people, where do I find you, even though we're connected? So I guess if you hit that bell in the corner, I enter your feed. I also have a Substack blog, which is free, which includes a lot of information and a deep archive of articles, and that's called the Cannabis Management Review. It's a riff on the Harvard Business Review. That's what we're trying to do, to bring a certain level of thinking and data to the industry, and that would, I think, could be found at mitchellosak.substack.com. But it is called the Cannabis Management Review. And if I could just say one of the key takeaways, Jillian, because I'll reiterate, because this is a leadership podcast, is what I said at the beginning, which is the archetype for a great leader and a winning leader in this industry is changing rapidly. And who I think the great leaders are today and who they will be tomorrow is a work in progress, but it's very different than what it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, whether it's in Canada or California or Colorado or any other major market. And that's exciting for me to see that, because now I'm working with a whole new roster of tremendous managers and leaders that weren't cut from the same cloth from 2016 and 2017. I'm sure Stephanie sees the same thing. And it's exciting to see that now best practices on leadership are starting to evolve and become prominent. And I'm privileged in a way sometimes to witness and see that in action. And I'm going to start sharing many more of those best practices in my writings going forward.
I love that, Mitchell. I know we kind of wanted to wrap up with two quick questions of, what's kind of one wish that you would have out there? What's one forecast you might have out there? I feel like we just got your forecast that we're going to be looking for, that we're going to be seeing, an evolution of leadership and the kind of changing demands and needs for that. So, final question before we head out. What's your one kind of forecast for the rest of the year that we should all be looking out for and maybe preparing for?
A forecast. This is a broad one, and I hate to end these delightful podcasts on a down note, but we're facing, when I mean we, I'm talking about North American cannabis, an extinction event. It's underway right now with companies that are going out of business, literally evaporating. There's the larger ones like Gold Floor and so on, the prominent U.S. companies going down
Mhm.
by the wayside. There are many Canadian ones, but there's going to be hundreds of others that are just going to evaporate, dispensaries, small producers, and so on, that are going to go out with a whimper and not a bang. I hate to say this, but we have to go through this as an industry to come out the other side with healthier companies, with stronger brands, with better management teams, more focused and fewer companies. But the forecast is just really, really choppy times ahead. And sadly and unfairly, a lot of great companies are not going to make it, and partially out of bad luck as much as anything else. And I'm pained to see that, because we're talking about people's jobs, their careers, investor money, supplier relationships. But I think ultimately we have to go through this leaching, this medieval bloodletting and leaching, to have healthier companies and a healthier industry into 2026.
Part of the cycle of life, unfortunately. And I think for me, my piece of advice would be lean into our communities and our networks to support each other as we go through this.
And good people, because very quickly I'll just say that some of the winning companies I'm seeing have ecosystems and networks of best in class service providers like Emerald, like yourself, and they're starting to gravitate more towards each other, and that becomes a competitive advantage in the industry, because your partners provide amazing value for you in terms of networks and quality of work and so on and so forth. And the best companies are doing that. They're leveraging organizations like yourself. So, kudos to you for helping, putting more wood behind the spears of many of these companies.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Mitchell. And as we close out, Stephanie, let folks know where they can reach you for more amazing LinkedIn content that you put out there.
Absolutely. So I appreciate all that. And as we've all just said, we know rough times are ahead, but the best way is to lean in together, help each other, phone a friend. You're not alone. There's so many people going through this, whether you're an operator while you've just lost your job, like there's people to talk to. So know this network is here for you. In terms of following along with what I'm doing, following Emma Lane on LinkedIn, we're going to start providing a lot more thought leadership and sort of insights we're getting along the way. We post all of our new jobs in there. We just actually signed our clients in our 5th continent. So we are truly global, and really excited to announce a lot of exciting jobs and to, again, bring in leaders from around the world to help these new emerging markets to really set the foundation. So I'm beyond excited, and I'll be definitely pointing people in the direction of Mitchell to start to get that thought leadership and joining us in Berlin next month or later this month, I guess, Jill. So this has been a wonderful conversation. I really have appreciated it. So thank you so much, Mitchell.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
We appreciate it. And thank you all for listening. And that's it for today's episode. Thanks, everyone.